Good. Well, I don't have to remind you that anthropology is the study of what it means to be human. And so it must be at least part of our task to explain why it is that out of 220 primate species, we humans are the only one which talks. And our argument, which we're going to give this evening, is that the reasons are fundamentally social and political. Monkeys and apes live in dominance hierarchies. There's nothing at all communistic or egalitarian about their political arrangements. Whereas we humans, we evolved as hunter-gatherers, assertively egalitarian hunter-gatherers. And so the short version of our theory is that laughter and language go together, emerging simultaneously as our egalitarian ancestors turned primate politics upside down. So if you live in a despotic dominance hierarchy, you win status and reproductive success by Machiavellian strategies of cheating, deceiving, and opportunistically making and breaking alliances. And above all, you need double standards. Don't apply the golden rule. Don't treat yourself the way you treat others. And so you get this striking disconnect between what you know yourself and what you want others to know, and what you want whether you want to help others know what you're thinking, what your intentions are. And in all non-human primates, this translates as the almost total disconnect between cognition and communication. Non-human primates have rich conceptual capacities, but from a human standpoint, they seem strikingly bad at communicating their thoughts to one another. So we want to work out how to explain this. The human tongue, lips, jaws, and teeth, they're known by linguists as the speech articulators, and these have obvious primate counterparts. In apes and monkeys, they have the same kind of lips and teeth and jaws and so on and so forth, but these are restricted to basic functions such as chewing and breathing. They don't do communication, and in fact when a monkey or ape emits a scream, it doesn't use the tongue at all. And this is, of course, for humans, when speaking, this is the prime articulator. We call languages tongues for a very good reason. So Klaus Zuberbühler, with his colleagues at St Andrews, he's done more than perhaps anyone to explore to the limit what flexibility there is in non-human primate vocal communication. Yet even they conclude that non-human primates have, and this is their words, little control over their articulators, being curiously limited, showing little evidence of cognitive flexibility and creativity. Like almost everyone else currently specializing in the evolution of language, Zuberbühler describes these monkey and ape expressive limitations as deficiencies. And one deficiency is a lack of sophisticated control over the articulators, and the other is a remarkable shortcoming in social cognition. So if you ask any academic who's been studying these sorts of issues, they'll tell you that a genetic mutation for sophisticated tongue control would have obvious communicative advantages for any evolving bipedal primate at some point during human evolution. They all assume one or more genes must have connected cognition with communication by establishing full cognitive control over the tongue. Well, let's think for a moment. Volitional control can't really be the deciding factor. It's not at all unusual for a mammal to open or close its jaw while calling or screaming. They also move their lips around. And the vocal anatomy of big cats, lions, tigers, jaguars and leopards corresponds so closely to our own that we might almost imagine that lions could talk. Yet of course they don't. That's a point made by Tecumseh Fitch, that the vocal anatomy looks remarkably like our own. But most relevant of all, any ancestral hominin must always have had volitional control over its tongue. If you couldn't control your tongue, you couldn't swallow your food properly. No ape or monkey has an inflexible tongue. But here's the rub. When the animal needs to communicate a thought, it leaves the tongue out of it. In other words, it's got that marvelously flexible organ there in its head, but it doesn't use it. It's this obvious fact which keeps getting overlooked. What have these animals got against the tongue? In our view, this is what needs to be explained. And now I think, is it over to you?
No, you carry on.
Oh, I carry on. We've just got a different slide. Right, okay. So well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? This is the attitude that primates have. They want to be sure that the message they're getting is reliable. So this is Darwinian signal evolution theory, and these Darwinian theories have a very good explanation for this failure to use the articulators. When responding to signals, apes living in the wild prefer direct sensory evidence over unverifiable claims. If you're intentionally manipulating the signal, playing around with it as you like, why should anyone take the signal seriously? Why should anyone believe? In a Machiavellian world of rivalries and conflicts, it's the hard to fake body signals, the steady or shifty eyes, the beads of perspiration, these things that you can't control, that for that reason carry a conviction. The more flexibly tongue-like the signal, the lower its chances of being accepted as either reliable or worth responding to, and so the less likely it is to evolve for communicative functions. So it all boils down, in our view, to this question: to tongue or not to tongue? Groucho Marx put it in his own way when he asked this question: who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? If the tongue is flexible, that makes it correspondingly unreliable, and in confirming this pattern, modern Darwinian signal evolution theory backs up Groucho Marx. Mistrusting one another's scheming Machiavellian minds, primates ignore the tongue, preferring the evidence of their own eyes. And another slide. It's different when both sides, signaler and recipient, are up close. So here we have two chimps up close to each other, and manual gesturing can then be cognitively controlled and flexible. So we might say, why, if they can control their manual gestures, why doesn't the same apply to their vocal signalling? What are the overriding evolutionary constraints apparently acting across primate communication in general, which so strikingly limit flexibility in the use of sound? So again, our argument is that the decisive factor is trust. Sound carries over distances, it goes around corners, it works in the dark, and doesn't require receivers to be facing the right way. Sound can focus attention on an urgent message. On hearing an anti-predator alarm, listeners must respond quickly with a reflex action, accepting the message on trust. But when you can't see who's making that sound, it makes it harder to judge how reliable it is. And so to be safe, non-human primates respond preferentially to audible sounds which just cannot be manipulated or faked. So we're addressing the origins of language much as economic anthropologists address the origins of money. In either case, the key ingredient is trust. Where does that come from? So we're arguing, like the watermark in a banknote, the inflexibility of primate vocal signalling is the feature which inspires trust. So it's not a genetic deficiency at all. In a Darwinian world, it's how apes and monkeys reassure one another that their signals are not fakes. Next slide. So, the eyes illustrate the same point in a different way. Primate dark on dark eyes. The obscure direction of gaze, obstructing others from looking in. For primates, this is adaptive. A dominant male gorilla needs to survey others' mental states, but it doesn't want those others to reciprocate by inferring its thinking. So it has no interest in exposing itself to surveillance in return. So there's this radical disconnect between the eyes looking out, these eyes are for looking out, and human eyes, which are also for looking in. So the human eye, you can see, is quite different. It features a dark iris, starkly visible against a white sclera background. Eyes of this kind foster transparency and are in that sense reversible, designed not only for looking out but also for looking in, suggestive of turn-taking, role reversal, egalitarianism, two-way mind-reading, or as it's called by psychologists, intersubjectivity. Michael Tomasello's one-year-old cognitive revolution. He describes how a human child at about the age of 1 begins to see others as intentional agents like itself, and it even begins to see itself as others see it. And he calls this a revolution, a psychological or cognitive revolution. So what we're arguing is that what applies to eyes applies equally to vocal communication. Hence the striking disconnect between primate vocal production, which is conceptually impoverished. Their vocal signalling is not at all rich, but what they infer from the signalling conceptually is strikingly rich. They've got perfectly good conceptual capacities, comprehension capacities. So this again suggests competition to establish dominance. After all, if you're dominant, as this guy here is, it's good to know about your subordinates' thinking, but not good for them to know about your thinking. In primates, this disconnect prevents language from even beginning to evolve. Language presupposes a willingness to put ourselves in one another's shoes, avoiding double standards, applying to others the principles that we apply to ourselves. Okay, and then the next slide, sorry, Jerome, yeah. So we're just looking at this is a repertoire, Jane Goodall's repertoire of the different vocals, signals of chimpanzees. And you can see, can't you, when they're all actually body language. They're all describing what's going on in the body, whether you're copulating, whether you're distressed, and all those things. So constraints on primate vocal production. Juvenile primates love to play, but pressure for reliability constrains their vocal play. So you can kind of see why that is. Imagine what would happen if a mutant vervet monkey, a special monkey or a chimpanzee, could and began to freely play around with its predator alarm calls. The animal would then be noticed by conspecifics for doing that, and it would lose all credibility and be ignored. So to summarise this section of this evening's talk, unlike emotionally anchored changes of pitch, body language, tongue modulations, which of course the part of language is digital and conceptual, are freely volitional. Paradoxically, that's precisely why primate vocalizers set aside the tongue. It's just too unreliable. Hence the tongue plays no role in a chimpanzee pantoot and copulation screams and so forth. By contrast, human evolution has co-opted the tongue, possibly the most flexible part of our body, as the primary speech articulator. So we face a conundrum. How could natural selection have switched from quarantining the primate tongue, excluding it from all but a marginal role in vocal communication, to developing and fine-tuning the same tongue as the most important speech articulator of all? Since this development was biologically unprecedented, something quite specific and remarkable must have happened, and the challenge is to narrow down what it was.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. What we're doing is switching between the bits we thought about together. I mean, this is a joint project, but it's one which we have different, or we bring different bits of evidence to the discussion. So obviously language first evolved among hunter-gatherers, since that has been the form of life that human beings have had for the large part of our existence. And so to a greater extent than farmers or city dwellers, extant hunter-gatherers can offer us insights into the possible dynamics involved in the evolution of language. Western theoretical linguists may be surprised by the concepts that occupy the minds of hunter-gatherers. Core concepts connect women's blood with the blood of hunted animals, the moon's changing phases, hunting luck, health, fertility, sharing, kinship, and the spirit world. The assumed connections might in principle be expressed in a modern city dweller's language, and indeed I tried that in a paper called Aquila. It comes to about 10,000 words to explain in modern town dwellers or our modern English what my hunter-gatherer friends in Congo mean when they talk about Aquila. It really does make the concept seem contradictory when you start to list all the different meanings that it has. And it's very typical among hunter-gatherers that they have a single word for this sort of hodgepodge of different practices and beliefs. Among the Mbengele and the Baka, it's called Aquila. These are pygmy groups in Central Africa. Among the Mbuti, who are 1,000 miles to the east, they call it Ekeri. Among the Hadza, it's called Epeme. It is similar concepts also exist beyond Africa. So, for instance, in Southeast Asia, the Chewong call it Punen, and they have a whole set of activities and beliefs around Punen. Among the Batek hunter-gatherers in Malaysia, you have Lawak. In Australia, the rainbow snake is or was the imagined synchronization of women's blood flows with the equally sacred blood of kangaroos and other game animals, and it resulted in a wet-dry alternation that was responsible in turn for switching the weather between sunshine and rain, dry seasoned and wet. And the San concept of no is very similar to this Australian one in linking the blood of women with the blood of animals and changing weather. It's a very sort of odd logic. But if we stumble to comprehend the logic, it may be because, as Heinrich and his colleagues have pointed out, pointed out, our horizons are confined to those of an exotic group, namely people from Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic or weird societies. To connect back to the origins of language, we need to escape from this weird position. In his groundbreaking book, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, the linguist George Lakoff warned us not to expect indigenous categories to match the way Western science carves up the world. Hunter-gatherers' semantic meanings arise out of metaphors which make sense in the light of their reproductive subsistence and other strategies, not ours. If cross-cultural uniformities are discernible, if the underlying syntax of hunter-gatherer ritual and myth largely resists historical change, it's not because these patterns are fossilized survivals. Rather, if you're living by hunting and gathering, such cognitive strategies are good ways to respond to and interpret the world. The solutions arrived at by successive generations of hunter-gatherers may be thought of as optimal responses, evolutionarily stable cognitive and practical strategies shaped by challenges likely to vary only within a limited range. In what follows, we're going to focus on ethnographic data from Africa. Following Alan Barnard, we regard hunter-gatherers from this part of the world as offering a better fit to the conditions of modern human social origins than those from other continental regions. James Woodburn analysis of the shared cultural traits across the world's hunter-gatherer societies shows that they're either immediate return or delayed return. With a particular focus on the simplest of these systems, immediate return societies, he elucidates a set of social practices that are shared across these assertively egalitarian hunter-gatherers. Economic relations are egalitarian through procedures that impose sharing, called demand sharing, or anyone with more than they can immediately consume, which prevents saving and accumulation, which can then be used to exert power over people who don't have. People are systematically disengaged from property and therefore from the potential for property to be used to create dependency. Each member of such a society has direct individual access to the resources on which they depend for their survival, to the means of coercion, and to freely move where they want. Such societies are politically egalitarian since no one can coerce others to do their will. People who brag or try to assert themselves are mercilessly teased, avoided, and if they persist, they may even be exiled. Such societies include some pygmy groups in Central Africa, the Aka, Baka, Bayaka, Biaka, Efe, Mbenjele, Mbuti, and so on. Hadza in Tanzania, some San groups in Namibia and Botswana, several groups in India such as the Andaman Islanders, the Hill Pandaram or the Nayaka, and in Southeast Asia the Agta, Batek, Manik, Penan and others. This worldwide distribution of immediate return traits among indigenous hunter-gatherers suggests that such social systems are likely to have great antiquity. Indeed, Whiten and Erdl, in a paper from 2012, described this remarkable set of similarities as the human socio-cognitive niche. Since primates demonstrate some related capacities, it's possible to make inferences about the ancestral cognitive foundations on the basis of which 5 core components distinctive to humans have evolved. These are 1. Egalitarianism, 2. A gendered division of labour, 3. Two-way mind reading, also known as intersubjectivity, 4. Language, 5. Cultural transmission. This social, cognitive and behavioural complex allows a human hunter-gatherer band to function as a unique and highly competitive predatory organism. The greatest number of contemporary hunter-gatherers in the world, estimates range from between 100 to 500,000 people, inhabit the forests of the Congo Basin. By combining linguistic material, culture and genetic evidence with the paleoecology of the region, Bausche concludes that the ancestors of today's pygmies began populating this area 40 to 30,000 years ago, when the forests were expanding. As the forests subsequently regressed, these groups became isolated in forest refuges, leading to the genetic and linguistic diversity that's found amongst them today. Bausche tabulates his observations of cultural similarities and differences between these pygmy groups, stretching from east to west across this huge area of the Congo Basin. In particular, yodel and polyphonic music are consistently associated with hunting and gathering, with forest mobility, camps made of leaf and liana huts, woven handled axes, and an egalitarian political and social and economic order. And I'm just going to play you some of this music because it's very distinctive. So this is a style you find right across this region. It's not unique to any particular group, but it's a very distinctive style. In addition, gender roles are based on blood symbolism and all exhibit a predatory engagement with their environment and with their neighbours. These similarities suggest that their shared cultural traits are likely to be remnants of a more ancient pygmy culture dating back to an ancestral population. The evidence from pygmy and San groups converges on an association between hunting and gathering, economic and political egalitarianism, a gendered division of labour organised around blood, life governed by playful mimetic ritual, and a highly distinctive polyphonic musical style. So the San have a similar polyphonic musical style. It's slightly different, but it's remarkably similar. Too specific to emerge from convergent evolution and with genetic evidence proving a shared past, we interpret these elements as components of a highly resilient, effective and ancient African hunter-gatherer culture. Evolving hominins like hunter-gatherers across Africa to this day had two contrastive relations with animals, that of being both hunter and hunted. Mbengele Bayaka, living in the forests of northern Congo, Brazzaville, regularly experienced predation and attack by large dangerous animals, particularly leopards, but also elephants, buffalo and gorilla. Yet they also hunt these and other animals. The trope of prey interchanging with hunter is a widespread cosmological and ritual obsession among human groups. Think of the work of Maurice Bloch, Discola, Viveros de Castro. Indeed, it could be that this is the archetypal reversal experience inspiring the processes which we're going to develop in the rest of this paper. And Mbengele men, in common with numerous other hunters across the world, mimic many of their favourite game animals' calls in order to lure them to approach, and so kill them more easily. When in the presence of large, dangerous animals, they may try to avoid alerting them by mimicking bird calls or silently signing to one another. For example, they may even bend over saplings, point leaves in certain directions to show where they're going, or resort to manual signing in place of speech. They have all sorts of signs to show what animals are nearby. In storytelling, they tend to use the characteristic sounds of an encounter, the animal calls, thrashings of branches, departures and arrivals, in preference to verbal descriptions. And just to illustrate this, because it's difficult when you're such English speakers and European speakers don't use gesture in the way that hunter-gatherers do. The story this man's about to tell you is in a very typical, ordinary style. There's nothing special about what he's doing. This is just standard stuff.
Aondoa mbembo na maka mangwai nyoko sikuwa kakabuli kota mungu ya jamu bumbu angwe atama mangongo ndinge ala siko vetu mavana mayele musuko angwa tena mwana mna bimola ya abeke pembeka mwango tembona tapoto mu alors tu vois ça y a quand il va comme une balle le cosiko en haut wakakuna kondo wakasonga di makumangwai
So when Mbengele hunters use their vocal lures against unsuspecting prey animals, the sounds don't count as symbols. After all, the animal victim on each occasion accepts the fake at face value and is straightforwardly deceived. By contrast, when human hunters reenact the events in subsequent storytelling, the listeners around the campfire are not going to be deceived. They'll recognise full well that the elephant or other animal supposedly roaring is no such thing. It's all just make-believe. When vocal signals are accepted and circulated despite being patently false, we may say, following Sperber, that the sounds now qualify as symbols. With fictional status acceptable, costly signalling constraints no longer apply, leaving signallers to prioritise content and communicative efficiency. Potentially, at least, we're on the road towards spoken language. But symbolism is more than just fakery. To qualify as a symbol, a fake or replica must meet two further conditions. Instead of being confused with the original, it must be acknowledged as distinct. Instead of being rejected on those grounds, it must be accepted and socially circulated. Now let's return to the Mbengele. Whenever Mbengele women go into the forest in search of food, they keep together in as large a group as possible, singing loudly. Why do they do this? According to the women themselves, it's to ward off dangerous animals. When camping in certain parts of the forest, women insist on singing through the night. Each achieves a highly integrated yodeling melody that combines with others sung by neighbours to produce the polyphonic song. The challenge is to listen and attune one's own voice to others in the chorus, accurately timing each note. It could be that such exquisitely synchronized choral singing deters predators by exaggerating the apparent size of the group, rather as synchronized roaring by coalitions of lionesses conveys information about their numerical strength, perhaps helping to deter an unwanted approach by a roving, potentially infanticidal male. Our view is that Mbengele women's own interpretation of their singing is probably right. Taking our cue from them, it seems likely that women's choral singing as if one's life depended upon it, forms part of the explanation for the evolution of the remarkable vocal abilities underlying and prefiguring human speech. We favour our in-group, out-group model because we can see no other way of explaining how the reliability constraints obstructing the tongue's involvement in primate vocal communication might have been sidestepped. In the case of both sexes, intentionally deceptive sounds are directed not at Machiavellian insiders capable of mounting resistance, but outwards, against animals unable to resist fake versions of their species-specific calls. Whiten and Erdl explain, developing the cognitive niche has allowed human foragers to repeatedly mount evolutionary surprise attacks on prey, escalating the arms race between predator and prey such that the latter cannot keep up through biologically evolving counter-adaptations with the more rapidly developing clever technological and behavioural innovations of people. We suggest that vocal deception was a clever innovation, one such clever innovation.
So we now return to non-human primate social communication, and looking at that, can we discern anything which prefigures defiant choral singing? Well, the chimpanzee wah bark is a loud, sharp sound, typically accompanied by threatening gestures such as arm waving, emitted in response to a social disturbance. And I think we've got a recording here. Hopefully it will work.
Musa is on my side.
So they've seen a snake, and they use the wah bark, which you heard there, to warn each other about that and very likely to, I don't think snakes have got very good hearing, actually, but mostly these warbucks are directed at the threat. So Jane Goodall explains, the warbark is the comment so often interjected by bystanders during a conflict between others. So when there's a fight breaking out, so supposing some male's attacking a female, for example, all the other females will start to warbark. And the sound usually indicates, says Goodall, sympathy for the victim. During a male attack on a female, other females present frequently provide a running commentary of warbarks until the incident is ended. Often when the victim of aggression becomes suddenly bolder after the event, as when he receives the support of an ally or his aggressor displays away, his screamings change to defiant warbarks. She says that the warbark suggests an element of kind of normativity, as if there's kind of a collective moral force behind these barks. Well, Christopher Boyden examined several hundred hours of videotape recordings of warbarks in the wild, concluding that they tended to be given by subordinates expressing hostility to their superiors from a safe distance. And interestingly, the barks used by females toward badly behaved males are internally redeployed versions of the very same mobbing calls used to intimidate external threats such as pythons, as we've just heard. So to summarise, what's interesting here is how one and the same signal, the warbark, fluctuates and changes in sound and meaning as collective emotions and political circumstances undergo change.
So, where do the hunter-gatherers say it all started? Hard as it may be for us to appreciate the reasoning, hunter-gatherers across Africa assume gender segregation as the primordial human situation. Myths are not science in the Western sense, but as variations on stable themes, they can be richly informative. Richly informative about long-term historical continuities and processes of cultural change. Here is a creation myth, in this case from the Mbengele hunter-gatherers of the forests of northern Congo. In the beginning, the two sexes lived apart. The women caught fish and collected yams, while in a distant part of the forest, men hunted elephants and climbed for honey. Neither sex knew of the other's existence. To make girl babies, the women danced a jengi, a fertility spirit. In the meantime, far away, the men would copulate with mapumbe, these rather weird fruit of a tree. They've got actually a calabash hard-like shell with a white, sort of creamy interior. One day, Toli, the men's elder, was walking upstream when he noticed a piece of wild yam floating by. Only humans prepare wild yams by washing them in a stream. So he said to himself, people must be up there. He walked on. Eventually he heard voices. Approaching stealthily, he observed a new type of people dancing a jengi. Babies could be seen falling from the spirit's raffia clothes. Amazed, Toli returned to the men's camp, recounting all he'd seen. In disbelief, the men insisted on seeing with their own eyes. Next morning, they set off, each carrying a parcel of honey. As they approached the women, they heard singing, surrounding the females as if hunting wild pigs. Each grabbed one for himself, beating her with honeycomb. Struggling at first, the women soon tasted the honey. That's good. Who are these people with such sweet things? They exclaimed. Back at the women's camp, everyone enjoyed sex, the men abandoning their mapumbe fruit. Later, the women hid in the forest and secretly danced a jengi. On discovering this, the men seized a jengi for themselves. To this day, by monopolizing a jengi, men have obliged women to come to them for sex in order to have children. Well, that's the men's version of the creation myth. In the women's version, Toli is now a woman and actively leads the men to her camp. She went to find the men. She entered their camp. When they saw her, their men all got erect penises. She had sex with them and told them about her friends back at her camp. The next morning, the men left early, each carrying a parcel of honey. Toli led them all the way to the women's camp. As the men arrived, the women were hostile at first, but on tasting the honey, however, each demanded one man for herself. The men threw away their mapumbe fruit and everyone had sex. The women told the men to stay in camp while they looked for yam roots. One man followed them into the forest. He saw the women dancing a jengi with babies tumbling from the spirit's raffia clothes. He ran back and told the men. They said, "That's something for us men." Confronting the women, they demanded a jengi, and the women gave it to them. So men claim to have seized a jengi by force. Women deny this, arguing that they made a gift of it. If they could afford to give away a jengi, say the women, they must have been able to keep even more powerful things for themselves. Whereas men's edge is superior physical strength, a brute fact, women's claimed superiority is some kind of spirit power connected with the secrets of pregnancy and reproduction. The men ambush the women using pig hunting techniques. Could there not be a danger that male dominance and aggression, if allowed free rein, might culminate in rape? Accepting that the potential for rape is real, Morna Finnegan argues that this very fact explains why the perpetual motion against dominance must be continually reinvented. Women's countervailing solidarity depends paradoxically on provoking the threat of male violence in order to defeat it. The outcome is what Finnegan terms communism in motion, a never-ending pendulum swinging between male dominance and its celebratory overturn, between brute force on the one hand and on the other, female collectivized attractiveness and corresponding power asserted through song, ribald laughter and erotic play. The crucial point is that finally men opt to support the women in all this. The Mbengele have a word, masana, which covers both ritual and play. Women's answer to men's ejengi is ngoku, their own key ritual. Conceptualized as women's communal spirit, ngoku acts out the mythic theme of the primordial rule of women. As the performance begins, little boys run to their fathers and hide away. Men in nearby huts often retreat, some trying to ignore the raucous proceedings by escaping into the forest. As they disappear, the women seize the communal space, subordinating the entire community to their authority. And we'll just show you a brief snippet of what that's like. Sorry, I put the wrong bit of film. It hasn't got all the subtitles. I really apologise about that. There's some really wicked one-liners. And without the subtitles, you won't. So, I mean, one of the things, for instance, there were, he's come too soon, and they've got the wobbly penis dribbling semen. The girls trying to have sex, they're saying, he can't get it in, he can't get it in. Talking about, men who can't get it up. So it's sexually educative at the same time as very clearly making men feel vulnerable about their weaknesses, even despite their brawn. In certain situations of supreme importance, they are unable. So, for instance, they may sing Doto Badie e Be, old men are no good, we like young men. Or their testicles are broken. The vagina always wins, because the penis exhausts itself too fast. And they have other dances which are very eroticised. For instance, they'll all lie on their backs, rubbing their thighs together until they become frenzied and are lifted up from behind by an elder Ngoku initiate. And you saw the examples of beautiful young women having sex with other girls and just sending all the men who find those women desirable, but then they're doing what men should do, and all the sort of clashes it creates for the men watching these things. Anyway, women graphically express erotic desire, which they can safely do only by acting in solidarity to defy male desire. Their teasing occasionally provokes an angry male response. You may have noticed the two men. One was smiling and laughing, and the other didn't look very chuffed. And in fact, the one who didn't look very chuffed is one of those men who will often try and sleep around and do all sorts of things that the women don't approve of. Their teasing occasionally provokes an angry response, but no man would dare to interrupt the performance. Instead, he must wait until it's over and then, if he insists, confront his wife. This may be dangerous because he'll quickly be surrounded by other women ridiculing him and supporting her. In addition to being intrinsically enjoyable, Ngoku makes it more likely that as the pendulum swings back, subsequent relations with men will be on women's terms. So, do the men feel angry and humiliated? Not normally. They usually join in good-humouredly, eventually laughing at their wives' hilarious impersonations of themselves. These reenactments are displayed with such exaggeration and parody so as to provoke helpless laughter. In waging the battle of the sexes, then, women can afford to go the whole way, to the point of momentarily ruling over men. Men resist women's collective action, retaliating with impressive rituals of their own, but stop short of physical violence, insisting on victory only up to a point. Once satisfied, they draw back, minimizing sexual conflict and letting the pendulum swing back the women's way.
So we're now turning to the significance of gendered reproductive strategies. Gregory Bateson understood the theoretical significance of play. Jerome's mentioned Masana. The Bengali have the same word for play as for religious ritual or for ritual. But he understood the significance of play for the evolutionary origins of human symbolic communication. And he was looking at monkeys and observed that when young monkeys playfully bite and chase one another, their antics are aggressive. They constitute violent aggression, except that the intended meaning is reversed. And his argument was that a playful nip, is an aggressive bite, as if prefaced by the message, this is only play. The animal's preliminary play invitation, and sometimes with chimpanzees, for example, it might be adoption of a play face. It means, in effect, he put it, the aggressive actions which follow are not to be mistaken for real. So like the Bengali men and women in ritual, in a play fight, each side can now afford to lose the battle for the sake of the game. Turn-taking, each partner's willingness to reverse roles, is essential to the logic of animal play, Bateson was arguing, as it is to the dynamics of human conversation. You speak and I'll listen, and then I'll speak and you listen. So Masana playful rituals such as Ngoku that we've just seen outlaw sexual violence. So liberating play from sexual conflict. So there is always a potential for sexual conflict, but these rituals prevent it from becoming bitter and irresolvable. So in humans, playfulness embraces sex. each gender taking turns to playfully dominate the other. Well, among primates, it's the other way around. It's sexual conflict which puts an end to play. So with primates, they may play when they're young, but as they reach sexual maturity, the play fights turn into fights for real, and everything stops. So as monkeys and apes mature, it's sex which most decisively dispels the carefree atmosphere of their earlier years. Former playmates become deadly rivals, and conflict is endemic because in a fight over sex with monkeys and apes, you can't afford to lose. So ritualized play of the kind we've seen here actually pervades the very arena which in other primates, chimpanzees for example, leads recurrently to sexual violence. So among these and other African hunter-gatherers, as we've seen, sex no longer shuts down play. Instead, play, now scaled up as adult playful ritual, succeeds in transforming and pervading the entire arena of sex. The Medjedi word masana, as we've seen, means both play and ritual, and when we adopt a hunter-gatherer perspective on such things, it becomes clear how many of our intellectual difficulties stem from the manner in which Western science carves up the world. We think of play as completely different from ritual. We have completely different words and so forth, and we might do better to adopt hunter-gatherer categories and perspectives. So there were concrete reasons why it was evolving humans rather than other species that developed speech. So as they birthed increasingly large-brained babies, this is Sarah Hurdy's work, women faced heavier and heavier childcare burdens, prompting them to resort to cooperative childcare. No sooner had evolving human females got together to share childcare burdens than something else happened. Women began discovering the collective capacity to square up to dominant males, using their song-forged solidarity, which we now would recognise as ritual. So female coalitions could reject alpha male advances. Males are no longer competing in primate-style dominant, submissive relations for sex, and we're arguing that it had to be women that did this. Men trying to do this would just reproduce the infighting typical of alpha male dominant strategies. Female-led resistance to dominance and sexual exploitation culminated eventually in reverse dominance, outlawing violence or physical threat as a viable reproductive strategy for males. Reverse dominance continues to assert itself through gendered ritual and other levelling mechanisms. So instead of dominance and submission, and among hunter-gatherers, social life was now based on cooperation and trust, and political and economic relationships on egalitarianism. So once sexual violence has been marginalised, trust can stabilise, and among trusting adults, imaginative play was then free to extend throughout life, increasingly embracing it and structuring its flow. And in our evolutionary model, mothers chorus together to protect themselves from predators and develop rhythm and synchrony. Men hunted better by mimicking animals and so developing vocal flexibility. But in each case, vocal deceptions that are aimed at the outgroup become symbols when redeployed, abbreviated and conventionalised among trusting insiders. And we call this the reversal principle.
So all this prompts us to suggest a wider human evolutionary pattern of mutually reinforcing reversals linking vocal mobbing, song, play, smiling. Sorry, he wasn't meant to come yet. Smiling, laughter, ritual, and the earliest beginnings of language. Solutions developed to deal with threats from outsiders, once reversed and redeployed internally within the social group, become transformed into their opposite. The common pathway is that a hostile act, when reenacted under reversed social conditions, assumes a quite different form and conveys a socially positive message. For reversals of this kind to work, there must exist a dividing line between those who are in the know and those who are not. A coalition entails such a boundary, excluding enemies and including friends. Establishing the boundary restructures signals on either side of it, giving each a dual aspect. A given signal is now threatening or reassuring, negative or positive, true or false, according to one's position outside or inside the coalition. Note also that the inside-outside boundary is likely to fluctuate over time, hardening or dissolving according to the level of perceived threat. As a result, a former threat display paradoxically can serve as a demonstration of affection and trust. A grimace of fear morphs imperceptibly into a display of emotional security and relief. A manipulative falsehood reappears among insiders as a statement of incontrovertible fact. Turning to concrete examples, it's widely believed that the distinctively human smile evolved in some such way, originating in the non-human primate fear grin, a gesture of tense nervous submission. The relaxed human version of this primate facial expression, the good-humoured smile, would then be a fear grin under reversed social conditions, once the threat originally provoking it had dissolved. The ethologist Ebersfeld likewise argued that human laughter may be traced back to the rhythmic, hostile mobbing vocalizations of group-living primates, seeking to intimidate a common enemy. Laughter in the human case would then be vocal mobbing under reversed social circumstances, the rhythmic chorus now being enjoyed for its own sake once the former threat has unexpectedly dissolved. Extending the argument, our suggestion is that human symbolic culture emerged as a coalitionary resistance to dominance, culminating in reverse dominance or rule from below by an ungovernable collective. As Mbengele women demonstrate when dancing and singing Ngoku, the physically weaker sex can collectively reverse stereotypically submissive body language. The women's Ngoku replays this defiant reversal each time it is performed. While remaining seductive and sexy, they humorously mimic maleness to clarify that they are not right now yielding to male sexual desire. To the extent that ordinary primate dominance is sexual, reverse dominance, its logical antithesis, must equally be sexual. Subordinating passion to the rule of law is the foundation of society. It is rule from below.
So we've outlined a scenario in which deceptive vocal sounds, in being internally redeployed, begin to function in a quite different way, hinting at spoken language. But of course we're well aware that language is much more than a repertoire of imitated sounds. And so the question is, how did our ancestors get from simple repertoire of vocal fakes to the complexities of grammar? Well, there's a wonderful book called The Genesis of Grammar by two historical linguists, Bernd Hein and Tanja Kuteva, and they invoke this concept known as grammaticalization, which is a continuous historical process in which freestanding words develop into grammatical markers, while these grammatical markers in turn become ever more specialized and grammatical. And we can discuss the details of that in the discussion afterwards, hopefully. But for grammaticalization to start, according to these authors, you need just one thing. You need freedom to be creative, freedom to play around with signals that are pure fakes or pure fictions, freedom to say one thing while meaning something very different. Paradoxically, also freedom from worries about grammar. So, supposing you didn't have a word for a verb for spear, but you could imitate a spear or make the movement of a spear, there would be nothing to stop you using the spearing action to mean to spear. So that as long as you don't care about the difference between verb and noun, you can just use the one for the other. And the same if you only had a noun for dance, a word meaning dance, there's no earthly reason, so long as you weren't worried about grammar, you weren't worried about the distinction between a noun and a verb, to use the same noun, the dance, to say, let's dance. And possibly just to briefly explain this for those of you who don't know what grammaticalization means, supposing you had a society which didn't have a way of linguistically talking about movement through time. You could gesture about positioning in space and movement through space, but you didn't have future or past tense markers, for example. Well, you could just use space as metaphorically to indicate time. So and that's actually what we do very often. So in English, for example, you can say I'm going to London, I'm going to Paris, you're going to London, you're going to Paris. But then to talk about future tense, you could say the weather is going somewhere else. So it is going to rain. Well, so nothing's actually moving when something's happening in the future tense, but you can use space as a metaphor for time, and of course you then start to abbreviate it, and you say it's gonna rain. And eventually it's going to rain. So gn becomes a future tense marker. But notice you can't say I'm in London. You can't. Once you've abbreviated this metaphor to indicate future tense, It becomes specialised for that particular function, and that's what grammaticalisation is all about. So only if you were worried about grammar would such creative innovations pose any difficulty. And Heinlein and Taviton insist that no one bothers at all about grammar, or at least they don't bother to start with. And even though they give this example, he sneezed the paper tissue right off the table. Well, you can't really sneeze a thing up anywhere, but if you say he sneezed it off the table, you know what they mean. As long as you don't care about grammar, that should work. So they're making the point, kind of the opposite of what Noam Chomsky and others make, which is that you have to have hardwired in your brain all these parts of speech, distinction between noun, verb, preposition, and so on. As long as you don't care about all that, grammar will evolve. And over time, as the functions of words diversify, they become subject to subtle changes in the way that they can be deployed. Preferences become habits, habits become grammatical rules, and before long, unconsciously and collaboratively, the community will have constructed for itself a fully grammaticalized language. But when we're looking at the origin of language, we need to go back to where we started and work out, well, what factors might have blocked this whole process, blocked the grammaticalization process in the period before it took off. And what we're saying is that the age-old obstacle was the requirement for all signals to be reliable, all signals to incorporate a costly component to guarantee that their reliability. And going back to where we started, roars, screams, pantoots, and all those kind of costly signals are just not the kinds of entities that can be reduced, combined, or recursively structured in the manner that grammaticalization requires. So for grammar to evolve, speakers have to be liberated from primate-style worries about reliability. Listeners have to be prepared to give speakers the benefit of the doubt, evaluating truth, not signal by signal by signal, but on a longer-term basis, postponing judgment until the entire utterance, or perhaps the entire conversation, is complete, focusing at each point not on surface meanings, but on underlying communicative intentions. So the liberating freedom to lie, to be fictional, depends not only on the speaker. It proposes an encouraging, sympathetic audience who can make sense of patent fictions. So by outlawing sexual violence, outlawing the entire dynamics of primate-style social conflict, competition, and communication, women, we're arguing, fundamentally women, establish sufficient public trust for grammaticalization to get underway and for language on that basis to evolve. This was the human revolution. It was the revolution that worked. Thank you. But this is just to say that this principle of reversal could be carried right down from politics, through the eyes, to the tongue, and right down to eventually to language. So none of these reversals, you get hints of those reversals in other primates, but the entire repertoire of reversal depended on this culminating reversal, which we call the human revolution, the triumph of reverse dominance over primate-style dominance.